Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the sixth episode of our Spotlight on GitHub Advanced Security series, Automated Governance, Making the Right Thing the Easy Thing. My name is Anna. I'm an event planner for Reactor, joining you from Redmond, Washington. Before we start, I have some quick housekeeping. Please take a moment to review our code of conduct. We seek to provide a respectful environment for both our audience and presenters. While we absolutely encourage engagement in the chat, we ask that you please be mindful of your commentary, remain professional and on topic. Keep an eye on the chat. We'll be dropping helpful links and checking for questions for our presenters to answer. Our session is recorded. It'll be available to view on demand within 24 to 48 hours. With that, I'd love to turn it over to our presenters. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us, Anna.
Thanks, Anna.
I think it's showtime, Michael. You ready to go?
Yeah, let's get going. Anna, can you please share my screen? Thank you. Well, everyone, it's great to be here, and thanks for having us. So my name is Michael Edenzon. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Fianu Labs, an automated governance platform. And I'm here with Caleb Queern, who's a co-author of mine, Managing Director of Cybersecurity at KPMG. So today we're going to be talking about automated governance, making the right thing the easy thing. And we'll start with the definition of what this means. And this is going to be our working definition throughout the talk. And we'll start to drill down on some of these things as we get further. So when we talk about automated governance, we're talking about the machine-led evidence capture, evaluation, and enforcement of policy for software release requirements. Okay. And so when we talk about automated governance, we'll talk a little bit about the history of it. And the history begins in 2019 with a white paper that was written out of the IT Revolution group called the DevOps Automated Governance Reference Architecture. This was a result of a number of industry leaders coming together and identifying the need that they had in their organizations to automate the processes that led to the change record and audit trail of the change record for a software release. So this was a reference architecture that put together the ideal scenario of how you could automate this process, including immutable attestations, digitally signed packages, all the way up through a release set of attestations that could be consulted in the CI/CD pipeline. That ultimately gave way to the 2022 novel Investments Unlimited that Caleb and I were fortunate to be a part of, which tells the story of our experiences implementing the automated governance reference architecture in our organization.
Yeah, I think I was just going to jump in, Michael, and share that the white paper from 2019 got people very excited, but maybe not a lot of people. And so the hope was to make some of these ideas and thinking more consumable, which led to the novel that you see on the right-hand side of the screen. And as Michael is sharing, hopefully the fictional account of a financial institution facing some regulatory challenges was able to make it a little bit more real and consumable to a wider audience.
Absolutely. And it's written in that style of the Phoenix Project, where it's a fictional story, fictional characters in a fictional organization. And there's a little bit of drama added into it, but all based on real experiences. So there were a number of us that have lived it ourselves, and there are some stories in there that call out to real events. And others were, the result of interviews that we had with other organizations that have gone through some of these events as well. So we really do encourage that you check out that book if it's a topic that you're interested in. And we encourage you to share it with your coworkers as well, because it's really written for not just the technical folks at an organization, but also the stakeholders like risk, security, quality. So we do encourage you to share the book with them and use it as the change agent in your organization. So the book and the reference architecture are based on this problem that needed to be solved, which is that DevSecOps left regulated companies behind, right? All of the overhead that comes with compliance, that comes with evidence and attestations, led to the phenomenon where the overhead got so great that teams just started batching large changes together to absorb that work. And so obviously what that led to is more code being released in larger batches and all of the risk that that introduces, right? And this has a cost, not just in terms of reliability and potential bugs that come with large releases, but the sheer paperwork alone. So if we were to quantify this cost using the ITSM change management average of 72 hours per change at a really lowball $36 hourly rate, we're looking at a pretty quick scale of just sheer hourly rates to process all of this paperwork for software changes. So in this process, this is the life cycle that we're looking at, right? Everything from planning to code and commit through release and validation. The activity that occurs during this phase of the software development life cycle is where we really see this problem emerging, because all these activities are hidden, right? Software development is not a necessarily visible process. And so it becomes a retroactive exercise where you have to go back and gather all the evidence when it's time to release and submit it to the necessary approvers. And this is what that hidden process looks like. So the blue boxes are engineering tasks and the white are administrative tasks. And this is representative of what most large organizations have as far as a process for releasing software. And so if we were to overlay that on, a 1 month time window, you're going to see that the majority of these tasks, the majority of the time is spent doing these administrative tasks. As a result of our DevOps transformation that we've all gone through, the engineering tasks are pretty quick, right? You can run the pipeline and deploy to production. But it's all of these reviews and evidence submissions and approval boards that occur in the meantime that really drags out this process. And so when we talk about automated governance, we're talking about really tackling the administrative tasks in this process. Caleb, I'll hand it over to you.
Sure. Yep. Thanks, Michael. And thank you, Anna, for changing the slides. Before anybody tries to read what's on the slide, let's all step back for a moment and maybe set the mission at a high level. I think Michael's shared some of the trail that is leading us here, but ultimately what we're really hoping for is to enable our organizations to build high quality software quickly, often, and innovate and win in the market because of that velocity. And as the slide that we just looked at shared, a lot of the time spent, especially in some of these regulated institutions, is chewed up by things that actually aren't writing the code. It's everything else around it. And we're hoping on this presentation today to share some of the ways you might think about, removing the friction from those steps that still, even today, plague a lot of large organizations, and maybe especially plague those large organizations, so that they can compete and really achieve the missions that their leaders and their stakeholders are expecting of them by being great at software development. So on the slide in front of us, I have, I think, 4 slides for us. And these are, I jokingly say that these are like Caleb's 4 slides to automated governance, or 4 steps. Bear with me. Here's step 1 of 4. And I think we all have an idea of what the software development lifecycle might look like going left to right. And that's what we've got across the top of the screen. And we may also agree that at each step along the way, there's controls, behaviors, or capabilities that we can use to increase the likelihood that what comes out the other side and makes it into prod is something that we should have trust in, our customers should trust, and inspire confidence. So again, it's inevitable that when I show this slide, people start reading each box. I think you're really, tied up in which box is where, and are any missing. Pause for a minute, and all I'd really like you to do on this slide is just walk away saying, okay, we have a menu, and we can invest in different boxes here. I wouldn't expect anybody to try to do all of these. They're not right for everybody, but this is a list of options, a starting point, so we can have a conversation about what we do want to double down on as a way for those outcomes I mentioned a minute ago. So what we would do on this slide is, say, hey, we have enough budget or runway, whatever it is, to do these 4 or these 3. And that is an input into step 2. So I don't know if you could, actually, I think I can make the slide go forward here. There we go. Step 2. What we have going across the top of this table are our decisions from the prior slide. Let's say that we are GitHub customers. We're big fans of GitHub and GitHub Advanced Security at KPMG. So I've gone ahead and just, instead of writing SAST, I put code QL. And instead of SCA or software composition analysis, I've got Dependabot up there. We've got secret scanning as well. But again, these are the choices we made from the prior slide of across all the things we could do. Let's imagine these are the ones we've decided we're going to invest in. And what we would recommend is that, and a lot of our large clients, you may say, well, what does good look like as we're trying to get code out the door with all of these different options that we said we're going to do together? And some people will say, well, I think it's in the standards and policies over there. And somebody else says, oh, it's in Confluence down the hall that way. And other people say, well, it's in this one engineer's head. But what we would like to suggest large organizations consider is that we have a framework like the one on the screen here, where we have a risk-based approach that says for our high criticality apps, here's what it's going to feel like for all of these scrutiny going left to right. For the medium criticality apps, probably a little bit less intense. And for the low criticality apps, the one that runs the menu in the cafeteria, we're going to have a different set of expectations. And maybe in some organizations, 3 rows is too many. Maybe it's early days and you just want to say, we've got crown jewels and not crown jewels. That's fine too. But the point of the slide is to say explicitly, and I mean this word intentionally, how do we codify our scrutiny? For a couple of reasons that we'll come to in the next slides. But again, we're going to make this something that we can automate and engineer. And the 4 things that we do, 4 things we're going to declare for each of the cells here would be, what is the depth of this scrutiny? What is the breadth of it across the critter, the app, the repo, whatever? What is the frequency that we expect this scrutiny to be applied? And finally, what does it take when this scrutiny is applied for this thing to get into prod? If it's a high or medium or low, you're going to have different expectations. Maybe for a low criticality app, it's okay if it has a critical finding or some number of high criticality findings. But in a high criticality app, you would never let a high severity vuln or a critical severity vuln probably make it into prod. So anyways, that's what the hope is with this slide, the second of 4, which is to say, what does it really look like to define how we're going about this together? And I would also share that this isn't a table that the security folks should fill out on their own. This should be a dialogue between, I'll call it AppSec, and you've got your tribe over here from the engineering side, your CIO or CTO's dev teams. And then importantly, also at the table should be our good friends in internal audit, who have a bigger role to play later in the story here. But their job is to make sure that all the things we said we're doing, we actually are doing around here. So they should be present when all of these data points are agreed upon, because they're going to be swinging around later when they perform their audit. And it sure would be nice if they already know what to expect, because they were present when these things were agreed upon between the CIO, CTO's people, as well as AppSec. I would also share, and I'm going to keep moving real quickly here in a second, that we are intentional about getting better over time, because some of the, we could go really hardcore mode at the beginning and say, hey, one code QL, high criticality or high severity finding for a medium criticality app is a showstopper, not going to prod with that. But that also has costs on the business and it may slow things down. So you say, okay, maybe we agree that today that's okay to get into prod, but in 6 months, we all agree it's not going to be. And so you're just building muscle over time, collectively, intentionally, so that ultimately we all have even more confidence that the things that we're putting in production can be trusted. Michael, did I miss anything?
No, I think that was a really great analysis. And maybe just to help, the viewers here, I'll say that this is the exercise that needs to occur. And you and I have both seen this in many of the organizations that we work with. We all have requirements for software that's about to release to production, right? And so this is the exercise of taking those requirements, writing them down, right? and then ultimately codifying them. Now, once they're written down, they may be too strict or too loose for our risk profile of certain applications. And so the high, medium, low is one of the common ways that organizations are able to break apart the risk profile of each of their applications so that these requirements can be met, right? Sufficient to their risk posture. Caleb, would you agree with that?
That's the goal here. That's right. Cool. I'm going to move on to the next slide, step 3 of 4. Okay. So, Michael and I have been calling this automated governance. And so the governance that we agreed upon just one slide ago, we're going to automate. And so what that means in practice is preventing the deployment of something that doesn't meet the criteria that we agreed upon. Remember, the fourth thing for every cell in that prior table was, what does it take to get the prod? And so the point of this slide is to say, well, that's the next step, is now that we've defined it in the step prior, now we implement it here in a build pipeline. And of course, I know in some organizations, every app team may have their own build pipeline. Hopefully, that's probably a subject for another presentation, but let's imagine that we have our most important stuff on the same build pipelines or environments, maybe using things like GitHub Actions. But we would implement that deployment blocking here. And notice I didn't say break the build, because that can trigger some people, and Michael is coaching me on that, but blocking deployment here. Before I move on, Michael, anything here?
No, I think that's a really good call out, right? So when we went through that definition of automated governance, we talked about the automated evidence capture, the automated enforcement of events that occur during that life cycle from code commit to release and validation, right? And so what we're looking at here at a high level is the ability to either break a build or block a deployment, whichever is suitable for your organization, or maybe even a subset of your organization, based on that criteria that we wrote down in step 2, right? So that's the process that we're talking about here, is write down your requirements, codify those requirements, automate the evidence capture for the events that would help you meet those requirements, evaluate the evidence against the requirements, and then enforce at the point that's most appropriate, whether that's during the build or a deployment to a given environment, be it dev, QA, prod. And it's not necessarily as important when you enforce it as capturing that evidence. And then it's up to you, the organization, to place the enforcement where you think is necessary for your developers and for your organization.
Cool. I'm going to go to my fourth and final slide. And we've hinted at this and even said it already, but at each step along the way, we're going to capture attestations or signals or telemetry or logs, whatever flavor of signals here that help tell folks that the right scrutiny was applied when it was supposed to for the right things. Again, we wouldn't unilaterally declare that all apps get the same treatment from this type of scrutiny, whether that's CodeQL or some secret scanning, any of those things, again, in like GitHub Advanced Security, but the right amount of calibrated risk reduction, given the flavor or the risk profile of the app or the thing we're building together. Along the way, the point is we're going to capture signals of what happened and what maybe didn't from each of these steps in this kind of notional build pipeline or build process, all the way from the the source code repo on the far left. You may want to capture stuff like in the GitHub audit log, where what were the IP addresses of the folks who were submitting to this? Are there any unexpected IP addresses that we wouldn't expect to be contributing to our repos? All of that should be sent somewhere. Even maybe a Microsoft Sentinel type environment. The point is that once we got those somewhere, and maybe a tamper evident environment, a ledger, if you will, we can then have those on hand for when our good friends in step 2 from internal audit swing by and ask, hey, we're conducting an audit of the quality of the software we're putting into production. Show us what happened with these important apps on this date with these controls. And you can say, great, I'm so glad you asked, because we have this table we all agreed upon before. I've got the actual telemetry of what happened that day on this build for this app, just as we all agreed upon. And I can also, I'm excited to share with you that it's not maybe tamper proof, but tamper evident. You would know if anybody was fiddling around with what I'm showing you right now, because the hashes wouldn't match. So that is, I think, a high level view of the what of automated governance. Michael's going to share a little bit more in a moment about how, but Michael, did I miss anything before I pass the screen back to you?
No, I mean, I think that was great. Yeah, what we're really talking about is a traceability of evidence here, right? Telling a story through the events that are captured so that the auditor does not have to ask follow-up questions necessarily, right? Up front, you're gathering evidence with a mindset of what will I need to prove to the auditor?
Yeah,
exactly.
Not only do we have it, but we have it in such a way that we can all trust that what is shown in front of us is, again, I use the word tamper evident. Like, we should all have confidence that what we're looking at really is what happened for the thing we care about, which is handy for our auditors. It's especially useful for regulators. So over to you, Michael, and you can toggle back the screen to Michael.
Yeah. So what we're talking about here really is what's required to ship, right? Let's keep the main thing the main thing. There's tons of different metrics that we can capture from dozens of different tools, but let's start with what's required to ship, right? And what's required to ship is that you have to have proof that you did what you're supposed to do. So, I mean, let's take these examples, right? So I've got a few examples overlaid here. The Monetary Authority of Singapore, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and the FDA. And it's all guidance surrounding security testing, application security testing. So the Monetary Authority of Singapore says it's essential for the financial institution to establish a comprehensive strategy that may employ static, dynamic, interactive testing to validate the security of the application, right? And the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency has one that I really like, which is scanners or other tools can be run continuously. They can also be run periodically, right? And so what we're trying to illustrate here are these are broad requirements that are sent down from the regulator. And it's up to you and your organization to determine what you need to do to meet these requirements, right? And that's that exercise that Caleb talked about, which is having everybody sit down, write down what their requirements are. So, right. So have security write down and say 0 higher critical vulnerabilities from a SAST scan, right? And so that's how we actually take these broad requirements and put them into action. And this is important because I know, Caleb, we've had these conversations with auditors, right? This is how the conversation goes. So, you read these requirements and the company says, well, what does that mean? And the regulator says, make sure you don't allow vulnerabilities in prod, right? Well, how do I do that? That's up to you. Should I do SAS, DAS, IS, SCA, container scans? We don't tell you how to do your job. How will I know if I'm successful? Your auditor will tell you, right? So what this really illustrates is the process of taking the broad requirements and putting them into internal policies and procedures that will detail how an application needs to ship. So, I mean, what they're really looking for is something like this, right? So in the business process of developing software, there are certain risks that can occur, right? Those risks have mitigating controls. Those controls are instantiated with policies. Those policies have procedures that detail how you meet those policies. Those procedures are proven with evidence that is used to support attestations. So when we talk about automated governance, we're talking about automating the procedures of evidence capture and evaluation so that you can have attestations that will suffice the regulator's requirements. Okay. Caleb, do you want to chime in there?
No, I look forward to some Q&A at the end where we can add a little bit even more color around this stuff, but no questions for now.
So I'll talk a little bit about what we do here with Fianu and how it works with GitHub. So Fianu, as we talked about, is an automated governance platform. What that means, we do attestation, policy gates, and software asset inventory, meaning we capture the events, evaluate them against policy, enforce that policy either during the build or deployment, and then we capture properties about the software assets so that we can compute the necessary policy. So how that works is that, from the CI/CD pipeline during that life cycle that we talk about, we're capturing events from the various toolchain platforms. We're then comparing that against the policy. So then we can determine pass or fail and generate an attestation. Then that attestation can be used to block non-compliant software from deploying. Okay. And what our goal is to create this shared language. So automated governance is the confluence of a number of different shared interests from a variety of stakeholders. That's security, quality, risk, development, and leadership, right? And so this shared language is designed to remove the unnecessary points of contention around certain CVEs and at a broad scale, just be able to say, are you green or are you red? And if there are questions about why you're red, then there's a conversation to be had. But we want to make this something that's simple, right? We're trying to make the right thing the easy thing. The right thing is get to green. I see we have a question here from the audience. How should you manage exceptions to these requirements effectively without accruing a backlog of risk that never gets revisited? Caleb, what do you think about that?
Yep. So a couple, when I was showing the second of my 4 slides, when we talked about how we agree what good looks like, and that is risk calibrated across the different ways we've decided we're going to apply scrutiny to an app. And again, I'm being loose with my language, like app, system, platform, repo. We get it. But let's say we have a high criticality app, and it has a high severity finding when you run CodeQL on it. But it's really important for the business that this version get into prod. And I think the question is asking about how do you manage exceptions around this? Because this is a situation where maybe it does justify getting an exception from your governance, risk, and compliance team, the GRC folks, who are usually a separate body, often under the CISO's organization, who manage the backlog of things that we are giving exceptions to. Temporarily, we may say, okay, we agree that this is so important, it needs to get into prod. We'll give you a month to make this better, but in the meantime, you can go to prod. That is a reality. Obviously, anybody who's in the audience right now, who's in a large organization, is familiar with this process of asking for an exception. It happens a lot, maybe even too much sometimes. But I think, Michael, we would agree that the system we're talking about, an automated governance platform, should be flexible to accommodate situations like that, right?
Absolutely. And I think when done right, it can be, right? We've got security tools that can detect just about any type of vulnerability, right? The biggest vulnerability that comes then is that they're not being used or they're not being enforced. So one of the first principles of automated governance is to know about the things that are being done and their results versus the things that are not being done. And Caleb, we talk about this in the book, right? We have a whole chapter almost dedicated entirely to that conversation around the denominator, right? And how many times have we heard a CIO say, that's great, you've got a couple hundred applications that are performing SaaS, DAS, IaaS, but out of how many, right? Out of how many? And that's that conversation about the denominator. We've got 500 that are performing all these scans out of 650, right? But we need to know that information. In order to do that, we need to be capturing this evidence so that we can accurately target our resources and then prioritize our backlog. And even on the engineering level, right? Having proper knowledge of how far behind you are from the requirements that were established during that tabletop exercise will allow you to then go to your leadership and give them actionable data that will allow them to assign or allocate the necessary resources to solve that backlog, right? But right now, it's usually just a word of mouth conversation. We've got too much that we have to do. We don't have time to patch all these vulnerabilities. And then it becomes this downward pressure that, and I say this as a developer, but that downward pressure causes developers to bypass all these safeguards because they just need to get their job done, right? So having this evidence and being able to take it back to leadership to say, we need resources to get to green is a really important downstream effect of automated governance.
Sounds good.
That was a great question. So when we talk about this shared language, we want to be able to provide something that looks like this, which is, as one of those DevOps principles, continuous feedback, right? A clear outline of requirements for developers that say, here's what's required, here's where you stand. You're green on many of the items, you're red on a few. There's a few warnings, there's some things in progress, but then there's also things that are not found, which means there's no evidence of this occurring. And one of the major behavioral changes that we want to see in the adoption of automated governance is the shared understanding that you may be performing these tasks, right? For in this case, it's integration tests. You may be doing that testing. But if that evidence can't be independently captured and observed, it doesn't count, right? We need to get to this point where we're switching from subjective compliance to completely objective requirements. So if it can't be observed independently, then it didn't count. And how many times, Caleb, have we seen this where in large organizations, whether it's QA testing or security testing, where engineering teams say, well, I'm doing it, right? But maybe due to some misconfiguration, it's really hard to trace from an automated perspective whether or not it actually was that exact code repo for that exact commit that produced these series of artifacts that are in a deploy manifest that's about to ship to production, right? I mean, how many times do we have to do this retroactively where it's a word of mouth? Oh, go look here. Oh, go look here to actually prove out that those items occurred.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking again of our friends in internal audit who historically would come around, I like to say every 18 months, every 24 months, because it's on their backlog of audits to conduct. And they swing around and start asking questions about this type of thing again. And they say, well, I'm going to need some screenshots. I'm going to need to maybe get a copy of your config file. But that probably misses what happened on this day to this app, when it went through this build pipeline, which is the question they're trying to really answer. Like in that scenario you just described, Mike, how do we know that the way we all agreed this is supposed to work and hum, that turned out that way that day? They don't have that evidence nearby. This is a process by which it's collected beforehand, that we can all trust that there's nothing funny about the data. Nobody's gone in and tampered with it. And then we also can confirm that the configuration of the scrutiny we applied that day of the scanner was in fact what everybody expected. Because I think you've had examples, Michael, where somebody said, yeah, we turned on scanner X and maybe it ran, but was it configured the right way when it did? Did it, when the train left the station, did it come back? Did it complete its route along the way? All of those ways that you can goof up applying some of the scrutiny, we can hard code with a platform and a vision like this.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of those things where, I've seen it in a number of companies where they've been running in a pretty modern DevOps environment for a while. If you were to ask them, they say, yeah, we're getting evidence from our pipelines. And if, when you really drill down into it, it's something to the effect of, gathering logs, right? And enforcement occurs directly in that pipeline job. And then, but what we've seen time and time again is this scenario where automated governance is stood up. The evidence is being captured. We're talking about affirmative evidence here. The evidence is being captured. and we start to show higher critical vulnerabilities that have been deployed to production for a long period of time. And what we end up finding are that, at least one of their security tools has been misconfigured, for one reason or another. Maybe a while ago, they marked something as a false positive, right? But it all has to do with the policies that live in those individual tools that are set by the system administrator. Maybe not necessarily the same person that's the stakeholder, right? So you may have someone from application security that is the control owner for SAST, but the system administrator for the SAST tooling had adjusted the policies within the system so that critical vulnerabilities were not being documented as critical vulnerabilities, and applications were allowed to release to production for sometimes years, right? And so what we're trying to do here, go ahead.
I was just going to say, or maybe for what felt like the right reasons on that day, the dev team toggled off the SAST scanner, or maybe there was a warning about a secret being found when you scan for secrets in the repo, and they bypassed it. Right? That stuff would be captured and visible here, but otherwise, maybe not so much.
Exactly, right. And the analogy that I give would be, think of a toll booth on the highway, right? In its most primitive sense, automated governance would be saying, all right, if you don't have the cash to pay for the toll, then this arm is going to come down. It's going to block you from driving through or getting off the highway, right? And so the car either has to turn around, or you can let the arm go up with an IOU, right? But automated governance is not about necessarily having that arm come down, but it's about having a camera there that captures the license plate and sends a bill, right? And so that person drove through, they didn't pay, and you're able to do something about it when it makes the most sense, right? Because if you're not capturing this affirmative evidence to tell that story to the auditor, your point of enforcement is really limited at that pipeline job that runs the scan, or sometimes could skip the scan, in which case you don't have any detective controls around that mechanism, right?
And it's one thing to know and hold that team accountable that day, but it's perhaps even more important when questions start coming from internal audit, and even more important when the regulators start asking, show me that what happened that day. Did the video camera capture what happened when we let the car go? And most times in most shops, you might not have that video evidence around.
Exactly.
Cool.
Exactly.
So, hey, Michael, we've got about 20 minutes left total. How are we doing on time?
I think we're doing well. So I'll address this question here in the comments section. Presumably, this applies to Azure DevOps as well as GitHub Advanced Security. And yes, that is correct. So one of the things that we really try to do at Fianu is be completely tool and platform agnostic, right? So, organizations are complex. They've evolved over time. Sometimes you've got 25 years of software development on a variety of different tools. Sometimes you've made acquisitions along the way, and they haven't been able to merge into that one enterprise pipeline, right? So for all varying levels of maturity, we believe that automated governance should be something that should be tool and platform agnostic, right? Whether your pipeline events are coming from GitHub Actions, coming from Azure DevOps, coming from Jenkins, whether you're using GitHub Advanced Security or comparable tooling, we want you to be able to get to the point where evidence is evidence, right? And there are tools that perform like capabilities. So evidence captured from that tooling should all be stored the same way. And we think that GitHub has been a great partner, both with KPMG and also for Fianu, at making it easier than ever to integrate automated governance directly into your CI/CD pipeline, and Azure DevOps is included in that as well.
Yeah, maybe I've got a thought or two on this that hopefully we'll get to before we wrap up, but keep going.
No, go ahead. I think this is a good time to share your thought.
Okay, I was just going to say that one of the ways to me that GitHub makes this or enables this was with repository rules and how you can tag at the repo level something like business criticality. There's a ton of tags that are possible, and I think they're regularly releasing new default ones that you can drop on to repos, and they're not mutually exclusive. You can have several tags apply to the same repo. Maybe you label a set of repos for one app that is in scope for FedRAMP or some ISO certification or other regulatory scrutiny. Or maybe you're just using your in-house labels that we talked about back in the slides I showed, where you have maybe you're going to label using repository rules that this is a high criticality app or a crown jewel, whatever. But that makes it so easy to get started with this whole vision, because it assumes you've got some taxonomy and labeling applied to everything for you to do any of the kind of risk calibrated scrutiny that we've been talking about, and then capturing the evidence around that.
Absolutely. And I think that segues really nicely into the next topic that we're going to talk about here, and probably the last one before we open it up for questions. But let's circle back to what Caleb had mentioned originally, which is that policy depth, right? So he talked about the breadth and then the depth. So the breadth being the number of different requirements that need to happen. The depth being the specifics around for what software this applies to and what the actual requirements are for that particular piece of software. So we're going to use this policy example, and this is a real policy example, is that software that is risk tier 1, internet facing, and processes payments must complete a code QL scan showing zero high or critical vulnerabilities before shipping to production, right? And we see this as a common pitfall in organizations, that their policies were written for human or manual enforcement, not necessarily for automated enforcement, right? And so this last part here, code QL scan, zero higher critical vulnerabilities. That one's easy, right? You pull the results of the scan, you evaluate the vulnerability count, and then you determine pass or fail. But this policy, the depth is added to it by describing the properties for which software would then become in scope of this specific requirement, right? So when you think about, when Caleb was mentioning about repo properties, we're talking about accurate labeling of your software. So risk tier 1, pulled from your GRC database. Internet facing, detected via network configuration, or sometimes in most cases, it's just a quarterly attestation by the application owner who goes into ServiceNow and clicks, yes, this is still internet facing, right? Processes payments, right? That most often cases calculated from a risk questionnaire response, right? Sometimes, again, it's just nothing other than a quarterly attestation. And then lastly, the code QL scan with zero higher critical vulnerabilities. But then when we talk about the enforcement mechanism is shipping to production, right? So one of the things that we have partnered with GitHub with is to bring the automation that populates these properties, generates the attestations, puts them back into GitHub, and then gives you the control mechanisms to enforce with environment awareness, right? So capturing evidence, using that evidence to generate attestations, to maintain repo properties with automation, and then the awareness of environments so that you can actually set those policy gates with repo rules. So that's the last piece here that we had, and I think we should go to questions. So Caleb, this one may be for you, or we may have to punt this one because we may not be able to speak on it. Any plans to improve the costing model for GitHub Advanced Security, as it is extremely expensive at the moment?
Yeah, I don't think either of us are in a position to talk for GitHub's about the pricing, although I would share that you never know, things could change. Maybe things are changing. Don't know. We'll punt on that one because, neither of us work for GitHub or should speak for them. But the next question I see in the chat, I think we can definitely talk to. I'll read it out loud. It says, this sounds fantastic for a new app or org, but how can an enterprise with a large backlog of vulns implement a system like this without completely halting the business to get to zero? And I think that we mean by zero vulns. I've got a thought there, but what about you, Michael?
Well, I mean, I think it all starts from that first principle of, you can't start to remediate what you can't see. And it's important to view it with a lens toward the entire organization. So, as I mentioned before, automated governance is first and foremost about evidence capture, right? So being able to have a system in place. And I've had this conversation with a number of companies that say, quite literally, we don't want to see a bunch of red because it will cause the organization to panic. So actively saying, no, we don't need to see all this stuff. There's no way we can get to all of it. We don't want to know about it just right now. And I think to that, Caleb, I mean, this is kind of your bread and butter with how you help organizations to take the evidence that's being captured as part of automated governance and work it into a process that can eventually get to the end state, right?
Exactly. So if we think back to my second slide, which is that table of the columns are ways we apply risk and the rows are the things we apply them to, high criticality apps, medium and low. We would probably do ourselves a favor by acknowledging where we are today. And, to the question that came to us in the chat, how would we turn on a vision like that is declared in that table without bringing everything to a screeching halt? I think it would be by being realistic about what we're capable of today. And if we know that every time a high criticality app is going to just face this scrutiny, it's going to get blocked, we say, okay, we can't do that. So maybe we allow it, in that example I gave earlier, a realistic threshold, although, acknowledging this is a journey. We're all working together over time to get better, to produce higher quality code more often so we can win out there in the market. Like maybe for now, for the next 3 months or 6 months, we're going to set it that's going to let us continue the business. But we agree we're going to the gym together, and nobody's going to be surprised in 3 months when we tighten the screws and this cell on the table, so that we have a great story to tell to our leadership, maybe third-party regulators who come in and want to know how we're getting better over time. And we acknowledge this is a journey. It's going to take some time. So I'd like to think that we shouldn't be bringing anything to a halt because we're honest with ourselves about where we are today.
That's a great point. And I think the question we have here is, how do you manage the repo-specific workflows for security across all repos while still supporting the unique languages? Right. And right above that from Derek, do we have time for demos? I think a demo might actually show how we at Fianu would approach this. So I'll click over to that real quick and I'll just show you briefly what that looks like. So with Fianu, here's a real dashboard here showing all of this evidence capture. You can drill down into specific attestations here. And you can actually see all of the different results that occurred, right? We can tell the story of these events from left to right in chronological order, beginning with the pipeline job and resulting in the evaluation of pass or fail, right? This is your attestation that proves that you're either passing or failing, right? Similarly, you have your policy hierarchy. So we set a default company policy and then a specific one for high-risk applications. But specifically around languages, right? We look at it as a measure of properties, right? So these properties here, which Fianu captures and then populates directly into GitHub, right? We can actually go here and see the specific properties that have been applied here. Let me pull this up. Custom properties, right? And so for XD Banking app, right, we're able to capture its internet facing, exposing API routes, et cetera. So these are properties here that we can now set policy off of. Okay, so you can see we can't deploy to prod here, but we can deploy to QA. But let's say that we need to make a policy exception based on one of these. So we simply go to the policy console and we would create a new policy and we could select the control. So maybe for this one, it's code QL, right? And then we can adjust the different requirements using the template that was set forth by the stakeholders in that roundtable exercise that we discussed, right? But we need to be able to tailor the policy and say, maybe this one's not required, right? So let's remove the requirement for this for assets that have the property of language equals Golang, right? Simple as that, right? So now we're saying, all right, this is now, CodeQL is now turned off for applications that are using Golang, right? I know security would probably be scratching their heads as to why that's necessary, but it's to show you that you have that level of granularity. So now these are properties that are accessed via GitHub repo properties. And this policy then, when created, gets committed back to GitHub and instantiated as a repo rule, so that you can set your gates from the GitHub environments to say, all right, these are the requirements that I have to ship to prod, and I'm failing or I'm missing certain requirements, so I can't deploy.
Super cool. Well, I have a thing or two, a couple questions that I brought for us, Michael. Before we get to those, I think we've got about 8 or 9 minutes left. Anna, am I still screen sharing? Can you toggle over to my screen real quick? There you go. Okay, cool. So again, if we think all the way back to one of my slides where I said we're going to capture evidence from along the way across the end-to-end of building software, all the way from on the far left to the source code management platform, all the way to the right where we've got something in our artifact repo. People may ask, well, what are the attestations I might wish to capture? I think Michael just gave a great demo of how some of the content that's in a source code management platform like GitHub can be called in, and this scrutiny can be applied. I'll drop the link to what we're looking at into the chat, or maybe Anna, you can. But this is an old blog post of ours from a couple of years ago that just give other examples of stuff that you might want to bring in. Hopefully you're collecting at a minimum, and then maybe you can even orchestrate some of the, at a minimum, alerting and monitoring of this stuff, and maybe even preventing stuff from getting into prod if they don't behave when you get those logs and signals in the door the way that we're expecting. So thank you, Anna, for dropping that link. Michael, you ready for speed round questions?
Let's do it.
Okay, I've got a couple of things for you. Michael, who is this all really for anyways? Is this for everybody?
Yeah, it's really meant to be, like we talked about, the shared language, right? It's meant to be the place where your organization can agree upon what's required, what each of you need from each other, and what you'll be able to do if you meet those requirements, right? So we're talking about risk, security, quality, engineering, and leadership, all being able to come together, agree upon the necessary things that need to be done, right? We talk about what's required to ship, proof that you did the things that you're supposed to do, right? And so if there's disagreement about what you're supposed to do, it only adds to the toil that developers experience on a day-to-day basis. So this is really a sort of a gathering place for all of the different stakeholders to express their requirements, adjudicate any disagreements, and ultimately resulting in a clear set of action items that developers need to take in order to ship to production.
Is it for all organizations though?
Well, yeah, and I think that's a really good question. I think it definitely is something that becomes more suitable at a certain scale, right? So in our experience, organizations, especially around the 300 to 500 developer mark and up, really start to see this, whether it's basic SOC 2 compliance all the way up to SOX or FDA compliance. It's a challenge that emerges at scale more than it does, level of regulatory pressure. And I'd say to that other point, I'd imagine that some are thinking about, well, maybe my organization isn't ready for it, right? We're still in the middle of our DevOps transformation. And on that point, it's our feeling that, that move to a modern DevOps environment is the perfect opportunity to bake in all of that evidence capture from the beginning, because you're starting out with the foundation that will enable you to enforce the behaviors that you want going forward, right? And the outcome of automated governance, obviously, it's faster time to production, easier, more painless audits, safer, more secure code. But most importantly, it's a organizational behavioral change that enables you to move faster.
Yeah, and I like the call out a moment ago, Michael, to the threshold of developers. I think this is especially worthwhile for large organizations, particularly regulated ones, to consider. Maybe you're a medical device manufacturer, maybe you're a bank, maybe you make vehicles that there's testing and scrutiny from government agencies that make sure that those things that you're building and putting people behind the wheel that are more computer-like every day. Anyways, those are the folks who I think it's especially worthwhile to consider automated governance, because they can show that the things that everybody expects from them, they've done.
Absolutely. And it really is a must-have. I mean, we know this from having interviewed a number of folks and writing the book. There are organizations, especially in the regulated environments, that have paid a heavy price, right? Yeah. We talk about it in the book, MRAs leading to MRIAs, right? Which ultimately lead to cease and desists, an entire shutdown of the IT department of some pretty large organizations, right? I mean, these are they're pretty serious consequences to pay for not only not having the evidence to show to an auditor what you're doing and not doing, right? But being able to show a path to remediation. So for those organizations that feel like, we're not ready yet, right? We haven't cleaned up our pipelines. It really is important, especially in those regulated organizations, that you take the first step to start capturing the evidence, before you go any further. Because we can attest to, we've seen what it looks like when that doesn't happen, and it's a pretty severe price to pay.
Yes, those penalties are not cheap, and an ounce of prevention, right? I've got one more question for us, Michael, and that is, how long should it? Let's say a large organization, this journey towards automated governance. How long should they tell their leaders it might take to get this done?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we think about it in a couple different ways. We think about getting set up and capturing evidence. In our experience with Fianu, it takes maybe 2 or 3 weeks. Capturing the breadth of the entire organization can be a period of months on some occasions, right? That behavioral change really starts to happen around the third quarter or fourth quarter of that first year, to start to show that, hey, this is actually impacting our release cycle times. And then you're going to be on a path of continuous improvement, right? You're always going to be wanting to improve your thresholds, set higher marks so that you're leaving your organization in a better place. But as far as getting that first initial win of behavioral change and improvement in release cycle times, and an awareness of things that you weren't previously aware of because of this evidence capture, that's something that by the end of the first year, you're going to have a really great report to show to leadership.
Yeah, I think you answered that question both ways. I was hoping in a way, one of the answers is trick question. There is no end. This isn't something we're going to declare victory and stop doing later. This is the new normal. So there is no end. But probably the real spirit of the question of how long does this take is around how long can I suggest to my leadership I can safely apply this thinking, roll it out to our dozens or hundreds of dev teams across all of the tech stack that they've got. And, you might say something like, give me 3 years to the leadership. And they're going to say, you're crazy, get out of my office. And you say, okay, I can do it in top to bottom, across thing, all the complexity that we just talked about. 2 years, if I have your backing, that when we say this is the new normal, that I have your support, and there's not going to be a lot of exceptions made for people who think they're special. I think that's probably a little bit in the larger organizations. I'm not talking about small shops. but really complex global organizations they don't have just one build environment. They've got 15 different, critters running around of how they build code. To roll this out across very complex places like that takes a lot of time. And I'll say something very consultancy to say, it's not just about the tech. You've got the people in the process, and those are the things that can really take a long time. But it is worth it for the reasons we talked about earlier, because ultimately you've got a mission. You've got to drive competitiveness and great software more often that everybody can trust and dominate in the market. And this is one way to get there.
Well said. Well, I think we're at time, so we're going to wrap up. But thanks everyone for joining. Feel free to reach out to us with any questions, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much for joining. Thank you, Caleb and Michael, for an awesome session. You can learn more about this series, view past episodes, and register for future episodes at the URL at the bottom of the screen and in the chat. We're always looking to improve our sessions and your experience. If you have any feedback for us, we'd love to hear what you have to say. You can find the link on the screen or in the chat. Today's event code is 22898. We'll see you next time.